Talking about the background of Nosferatu is, well, if you've been with me for a while, we've been into some strange places, but this is a whole new roller coaster, gang. I'm not even sure what I can tell you about this that's necessarily going to be factually accurate. I've done my best. I'm accustomed to finding strange stories and contradictory recollections. The need to sift through the various accounts and try as best I can to find and share the truth. This story, though, is just weird. And it is hard to know how much of this is legitimate and how much is wishful thinking, and how much of it is exaggerated or made up to enhance the legends. Let's start at the very beginning with Dracula. According to his descendant, Dr. Stoker, Bram Stoker teased out a collection of events based upon real happenings, from arrival of plague soil on a ship to the strange presence of a dog and more. An anecdote is shared of a book available at the library only to those who know to ask for it by name. It's a dramatic assemblage of pieces until, like a Victorian conspiracy theorist, Bram Stoker crafted an account of a genuine terror that had found its way to their fair land. The publisher then refused to publish it as written, given the recent string of murders by Jack the Ripper, and it was only later, when it was fictionalized and given changed names from reality, that the work was then published. Now this naturally sounds dubious, although nevertheless Time magazine did publish this view of his ancestors' events. Others tell that Bram Stoker was intrigued by blood, believing it to be literally the source of life. That is, that through blood life can be stolen. Not just lost, but actually taken from one to another. The legends like these are all likely given more credence than they probably should be, due to the very nature of the material we're discussing. Bram Stoker didn't invent the vampire, certainly, but he crystallized the image of the vampire through his novel. Yet it should be noted that Bram Stoker was likely himself inspired by Emily Gerard's collection of Transylvanian folklore that she collected while spending years in Romania. She writes the following: "More decidedly evil, however, is the vampire, or Nosferatu, in whom every Romanian peasant believes as firmly as he does in heaven or hell. There are two sorts of vampires, living and dead. Every person killed by a Nosferatu becomes likewise a vampire after death, and will continue to suck the blood of other innocent people till the spirit has been exorcised, either by opening the grave of the person suspected and driving a stake through the corpse, or firing a pistol shot into the coffin. In very obstinate cases, it is further recommended to cut off the head and replace it in the coffin with the mouth filled with garlic, or to extract the heart and burn it, strewing the ashes over the grave. That such remedies are often resorted to, even in our enlightened days, is a well-attested fact, and there are probably few Romanian villages where such has not taken place within the memory of the inhabitants. First cousin to the vampire, the long-exploded werewolf of the Germans is here to be found, lingering yet under the name of the Pricklich. Sometimes it is a dog instead of a wolf, whose form a man has taken either voluntarily or as penance for his sins. You can see the influence on both Stoker and upon the film Nosferatu, including the use of its name. Stoker's novel was praised, but wasn't the financial windfall that the family had hoped for. The Icelandic novel Powers of Darkness has a preface by Stoker, which among other things states, quote, "I am quite convinced that there is no doubt whatever that the events described really took place, however unbelievable and incomprehensible they might appear at first sight." The reason for the preface by Stoker is that Powers of Darkness was a translation of Dracula, but with such differences as it is described as being based upon an earlier version by some, although others have asserted that Stoker himself was involved in some ways because of a similar Swedish version of the story. But regardless of that, whether Stoker truly believed that this was an actual account of events, or merely was trying to help generate buzz for the work, is down to personal interpretation. Stoker himself, it's been asserted, was a rather dull, everyday chap, So much so that his biography was described by one reviewer as being only interesting whenever the subject got onto his colleague Sir Henry Irving. While Stoker's novel was being created, on the continent lived the child who would one day direct one of the first adaptations of it, certainly the oldest to survive. Friedrich Wilhelm Plumpe, I am told it is pronounced, son of the owner of a cloth factory in northern Germany, and who was a very formal man. For instance, he demanded everyone stand at the dinner table until all were present, and only then were they allowed to sit down. Young Friedrich would try to get around this by keeping a magazine on his chair to read, but his father took it away. He seemed to have far more in common with his mother, who came from a well-known family and would play the piano and sing for them. While his father wanted him to be a teacher, his mother encouraged him to pursue his interest in acting. And so he went off, taking the name of Murnau, a city where he vacationed when he was young. And the budding talent was off, starting out working with the legendary Max Reinhardt. However, soon the First World War arrived. Murnau was sent off to the Eastern Front. While stationed in a trench in Lithuania, he became dreadfully ill and had to be brought back to Berlin for treatment. He survived, but was so compromised by the experience, he was told he could never drink or smoke again or he'd die. And they were habits that he indeed gave up. But the war took its toll in other ways as well. A friend of Murnau's perished, and the young man was deeply disturbed by it. He was now a reconnaissance pilot and was forced to make an emergency landing in Switzerland, where he was interned for the remainder of the war. When it was finished, Murnau was brought into German cinema by some of the old Reinhardt troupe, Ernst Hoffmann and Konrad Veidt. These films tended to have a fantastic angle to many of them, although we can only guess from the stills and descriptions. All of Murnau's early films are lost. One of them, though, an adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde called The Head of Janus, had an amusing appearance by an actor who was early in his film career, none other than Bela Lugosi, the man who, of course, would be famous as Dracula. Nevertheless, Murnau's style was coming along quite well. The young man had wanted to be a painter, but he just didn't have the skill to do it. His hands got in the way of what he was trying to paint, he would say. Film, however, allowed him to have the expression of that artistic sensibility without the need for brush or canvas. The film was his canvas. His choices of images to communicate ideas and emotions were groundbreaking and inspirational, and he was noted among his crew for having a mastery of optics. He would use telephoto lenses to take shots that other directors wouldn't, take it from twice as far away because he was comfortable with being able to pull off those techniques, using them to great effect. It was this talent that brought him to the attention of a man who had the skill with drawing that Murnau wished he had. But the man aspired for much more, to create a... This is the point where we are almost certainly dealing with reality. It's just hard to believe because it sounds like bad fiction. I'm going to start at the beginning in the hopes that you'll see how this oddness happened. Keep in mind that we're talking about post-war Germany. Their population had been devastated by fighting the bloodiest war up until that point. Many sacrifices made, and all for nothing. There had already been a growing interest in supernatural and occult forces, and the thought of millions of people dying in so short of a time span in such a violent way encouraged the idea that there must have been some kind of spiritual or mystical consequence of that. Thus, Albin Grau enters the scene. In 1921, the first steps were taken to form the Pansophic Lodge, of which Grau was the chair, growing out of a study group into the esoteric, and Grau was made master of the chair. They were heavily influenced by Aleister Crowley's work, although they declined to declare Crowley master of the occult on the grounds that it reminded Grau too much of the time of Atlantis and the rise of a tyrannical race, and they did not want to risk a repetition of that. I suppose we must congratulate Grau for using his role in the exploration of occult mysteries responsibly. Before the war, there was a theosophical magazine called Prana, whose name comes from the Sanskrit word for life force. With a post-war interest in the occult, the word prana was being used on a variety of things. horoscopes, incense. It was a very marketable term. Grau co-founded the studio Prana with the intention of making occult films, which is what brings him and Murnau together. During the war, according to one likely apocryphal story, Grau ran into a peasant who claimed that his father was a vampire and a member of the undead, and that this had planted the seed in his mind about vampires. In other tales, he observed a spider sucking the juices from its prey and got the idea for vampires. Whatever the case, the idea was, naturally, to use Bram Stoker's Dracula to serve as the basis for the film, while including Grau's own ideas as well. You'll note, for example, the strange contract that Count Orlok sends in the film is covered in occult and alchemical symbology, which were all provided by Grau. Grau also conceived of the look of Nosferatu, insisting on the vermin-style appearance for the vampire, rather than the way that vampires would typically be portrayed as refined, sophisticated, even beautiful. Grau also storyboarded the film, drawing inspiration from the style used by artist Steiner Prague to illustrate the famous work The Golem. In fact, one of the pictures is a figure with some similarities to Count Orlok. The Golem was adapted to the screen by Heinrich Gahlin, who was approached to write the script for the Dracula adaptation. Because they hadn't purchased the rights to the novel, though, Gahlin changed some of the names and set it in Germany rather than Britain, assuming that that would be sufficient. Shooting for the film began in Lübeck before moving on to the Weismar at the start of August, as indicated by an advertisement a few days earlier in the paper for 30 to 50 rats for a film production, soon followed in the paper by an ad for a rat catcher. The film clearly shows a deficiency of rats in the final production compared to what the filmmakers were hoping for. Much more enjoyable was the filming on the island of Sylt, with a Y, so much so that Murnau shared with his companion Walter Spies a desire to rent a yacht and sail to the Pacific, Hawaii or Indonesia, somewhere like that. Spies would, in fact, leave for Indonesia 2 years later, and 4 after that to Bali. Ironically, having left because he was disillusioned with the goings-on in Europe, he was rounded up in 1942 by the Dutch authorities who feared any German was a spy, and Spies was killed when the Japanese destroyed the transport that he was on. Spies was technically on the film as an artist consultant, but there had been some speculation that he and Murnau were lovers. Things were further complicated heading to Prague, where the camera was held up for days by customs, requiring a large official fee in order to get it released, along with several unofficial bribes. But at last they were able to film in the beautiful Tatra Mountains for many of the scenes set in Transylvania. As a period piece, there were lots of horses and carts that were involved, although in one instance, when Murnau wanted to see the coach enter a white forest, he had the coach instead mocked up to be white, and then used the negative of the shot so that the black coach traveled through white trees. The Orava Castle was used as the home of Count Orlok, setting a trend as the 2020 Dracula series made similar use of it, as well as Season 5 of Van Helsing. There was also serendipity as they were shooting the raft scene. Seeing the ruins of a castle on a hillside was so inspiring to Murnau and Grau that it was filmed and added to the ending of the film. After filming the interiors in Berlin, the film was released to much hoopla by Grau, insisting it was the first truly occult movie. But he went all out in promoting the film, and this money was just squandered. It failed to be the success that they needed with that kind of an expense, and so Praha was dissolved, having made no other films but Nosferatu. What's worse, Bram Stoker's widow sued, and while she could get no money, the order was issued that every copy of Nosferatu was to be destroyed. Fortunately, there were too many copies to find all of them, and several managed to escape the flames. As for Murnau, his skill was so admired that he was brought to Hollywood for a lucrative 5-picture deal with Fox, during which he made the film Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, which was considered by some to be the best pre-Citizen Kane film ever made. Sadly, Murnau would not survive to make all 5 films. He perished in a car accident. His valet was a 14-year-old Filipino boy that some contended was Murnau's lover. Even accusations were thrown around that they were engaged in some kind of sexual activity at the time of the accident. Whether that was true or merely a slur is open to interpretation, but it did lead to Murnau's funeral being attended by a mere 11 people, although Fritz Lang and Greta Garbo were present. In a final yet fittingly creepy coda, Murnau's crypt was broken into in 2015, signs of occult rituals having possibly been conducted within, and his skull was stolen. A finale to what might just be the most bizarre film background tale that I have ever heard. Tomorrow, we'll take a look at the result of all of this work and insanity, Nosferatu.